welcome to another episode of the Claus Corner, the Zoom edition. Today's guest is Ixia Press. She is an author, inspirational speaker, life coach, designer, artist, and art consultant, and interspiritual and interfaith minister. She is also the daughter of Renaissance man, Vincent Price. He is the legendary actor that starred in over 100 films, including House on Haunted Hill, The Raven, House of Wax, The Last Man on Earth, and Edward Scissorhands, just to name a very few. He has also appeared in many television shows, such as The Love Boat, Batman, The Brady Bunch, The Muppet Show, Night Gallery, Mod Squad, and Get Smart Again, just to name a very few. He has 2 stars in the Hollywood Walk of Fame, one for movies and another one for television. He was an art collector, an art consultant, and is also a noted gourmet cook as well as an author. Is there anything this guy has not done? We're about to find out. Please welcome Ixia Press to the Claus Corner.
Hi there.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I am doing very well. You and I have been going back and forth because we were supposed to have this interview several times and I lost power. You were busy one time. So thank you very much for being on the Claus Corner. I've met you several times and you were always so nice and so gracious with your time. So,
well, thanks for having me on. This is going to be fun.
I
He was
can't
also
wait.
a dog lover, which I inherited from him.
I see that. What kind of dog is that?
He's a poodle mix. Allie, you're facing the wrong way, though. The camera's that way. Didn't you learn that from somebody in the family? Camera that way. There we go.
Hello. Well, you know what? Let's get right into it. As I said, your father was definitely a Renaissance man, but you know what? You're no slouch yourself. As I said in the intro, you're an author, inspirational speaker, life coach, designer, artist, art consultant, interspiritual, and interfaith minister. So tell me, what do you do for fun?
Yeah, that's always the challenge because I think I work for fun. And, you know, I really learned from my family that if you're always curious about all kinds of things, you will lead a really amazing life. And so I've just been one of those people who's curious about everything. So I guess I'm curious for fun.
You know what? I love that attitude because I'm the same way. I've done radio, stand-up comedy. I wrote a book. And I've done so many other things. Now I'm doing this show. I was in radio for a while. So yeah, there's so many different things out there and I want to try as much as I can. And I'm so curious about, I love knowledge. I love reading. I'll read the back of a matchbook just to learn something. Cause I have that same attitude too. And I know your father did, which we're going to get into, your father and mother, Mary Grant, but we'll talk about that later. Let's start at the very beginning for you. You were named after the play that your father had his first major success with, Victoria Regina.
Yes, I was. And also my mother grew up partially in Victoria, British Columbia. So it was a good combo play.
All right. And you're the author of 2 books. First one is called Living, Love, and Vincent Price, a daughter's biography, and The Way of Being Lost, a road trip to my truest self. So let's begin with the bio first on your father. How did that all come up?
It's 3 books. So it's Living, Love, the biography, and Way of Being Lost. So there's
okay.
Plus I've been a co-author on a number of other things. So
I'm telling you, you're very, very busy. Let's talk about the bio though. How did that come about?
At the end of my dad's life, he was confined to his bed a lot and really hated that. And so I could tell he was bored, and a friend suggested that we work on a biography together. And I thought he would say no. But, well, actually, the friend suggested we work on a book about art together because that was our passion. And I thought he'd say no because people had asked him to do biography with him, and he didn't want to do that. But he did want to do the book about art. And so that's what we did. And that was the second book on art we'd worked on together. And so I had the previous material because it hadn't been published and this. And so I had all of that material. And then when he died, everybody wanted a biography. And honestly, I knew that pretty much any horror fan on the planet knew more about my dad's movies than I did. Yeah. But I thought, here's all of this material that he gave to me. And it's about the things that were so close to his heart. And if I didn't tell them, then they wouldn't exist for the public record. So that's why I decided to do it, even though I knew that, as I said, pretty much anybody could have written better about the horror than me.
Yeah, I know you're not a big fan of horror. And I want to talk about that because what is your favorite movie of your dad's?
Gosh, there's a few. And of course, I've grown to love his films now that he's gone. I enjoy watching them.
Oh, yeah.
And I've come to understand horror. I was just reading an article in the New York Times about the new show called, I think it's called Lovecraft Country, I think it's called. And I was
Okay.
reading about the director and the creator of the show, I guess. And she was talking about her lifelong love of horror. And what she was saying, it was very much what my dad always said, that horror is a place that people can work through all of their very legitimate anxieties about the world. It's sort of a genre where people can go into the dark and face their fears. And I've come to understand that I guess I'm a little more like the Buddhists in the sense I don't like to take in violence. I don't like to input it. And so I can't watch it, but I understand it now. And that also opened up for me when I became friends with my dad's fans. When I discovered that what we shared in common was love, not fear. Love of my dad, love of cooking, love of travel, love of all the things that he loved, then I could listen to them and understand, first of all, that they weren't these scary people that I thought they might be, and also why horror is so important.
Yeah. Well, I heard you mention in other interviews that a favorite movie of yours is Laura. And I love
Laura
that movie.
And I would say Laura and Edward Scissorhands for very different reasons.
Yeah. Well, I just rewatched Laura not too long ago. He and Gene Tierney, the whole cast is great, but he and Gene are so great in that movie.
Oh, fantastic. And it's such an ensemble piece and so beautifully directed. It's one of those just iconic and classic film noir. Yeah. And I think any actor worth their salt who's really loves acting, maybe more than celebrity, I would say really loves being part of an ensemble and co-creating something. And I think that was very important to my dad.
Yeah. Now for you, I want to talk about your other book, The Way of Being Lost, A Road Trip to My Truest Self. What can a person do to find their truest self?
Well, so that I wrote that book a couple of years ago, and then the book that came out this year was called Living Love, and they're kind of a piece. The Way of Being Lost is really about my journey with the lessons along the way. And then the book that came out this year, Living Love, are 12 practices, many of which I learned from my dad and even a few from my mom, that are very simple things that any of us can do to shift out of fear and anxiety and stress and about all of the things that are going on right now through very simple practices of love. So the answer to your question is, how do we find ourselves? We actually align with love. And I'm not talking like Hallmark card, pink paint and unicorn love. I'm talking about the kind of love I learned from my parents, which is really bypassing all those voices in your head that tell you there's a million things that you can't do or you should be scared of, and connecting with the things that are in your heart, the things that connect you to love, as I like to say, with the big L. And by that, I mean that quality, that force that is bigger than all of us. And I really believe, and I've believed since the beginning of all of this in February and March, that love is the answer. I don't mean that in some really sort of benign way. I mean it in a very, very powerful way, that if each of us could listen to our hearts and be led by our hearts, we would all begin to look at each other differently, behave toward one another differently, make different choices in the world. And I like to say that if this were a Twilight Zone episode and we all woke up and all we knew how to do was love, the world wouldn't be the way it is. Because if we all approached one another from that place of love, every choice we would make would be different. And I learned that from the King of Horror.
Well, you can tell I love his horror movies, Dr. Phibes, House on Haunted Hill, and all the others, but you could always tell he was having so much fun playing those roles.
Oh, absolutely. First of all, he was the least scary person on the planet. I mean, completely just full of joy and this big bright light. And he just had fun with everything. And I think that's why so many people loved his movies, because here he was doing these really scary things. And in a world that was full of scary things, a lot of those movies came out at very scary times, came out during, sort of the ramping up of the nuclear crisis, came out during the Cuban Missile Crisis, came out during the Vietnam War, all of those things that were going on, very scary times.
Yeah.
And he was this person doing things that reflected that kind of scary behavior. But I think that the thing that people saw was his kindness underneath. And there have been countless people who've shared with me that they grew up in really horrific situations. And horror was a place where they felt that the horrors of their own lives were made bearable, and that my dad became kind of for some a father figure, for some a kindly uncle, for some a grandfather figure. And at first, when people started to share that with me, I could tell they were a little bit nervous, like, how will you feel that your dad, I mean, he was your dad, was somebody that I thought of as somebody who was a member of my family.
Yeah.
But that's the same thing I was talking about love with the big L. I knew from the beginning he wasn't just my dad. I knew that I shared him with the world. And it's actually broadened my family now that he's gone to feel like I have all these brothers and sisters all over. And I'm not like him in the sense he was a genuinely social person.
Yeah.
And I love people, but I'm much more of a hermit. I like to be quiet. I like to be in my own space. And so for me, that connection with people who I feel like are my brothers and sisters happens when I come out of my little hermit cave and I go to a convention or do an appearance. But the rest of the time, I carry the people who love my dad with me the same way I carry him in my heart. I carry them in my heart wherever I go. And that's, again, this really powerful sense that that's how love heals us all. It would be very lonely to be a hermit if you didn't have a whole world of love that you carry in your heart.
Well, I love the fact that you're carrying on your father's legacy by going to all these conventions, talking to all the fans, and introducing him to the younger people that maybe didn't know about him, in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So I love the fact that I've seen you at several chiller conventions, and you're always engaging. You will take the time to talk to anybody about anything. And, I see some people there and you can tell they're just like, all right, is it almost over yet? You're there till the very end. And that's why I love the fact you're doing that. And, you tell me you're a hermit, but the way you are and all the things you do, I cannot picture that quality in you.
Well, I think people think of hermit as a little bit of a dirty word. It's not. I think I'm an extroverted introvert.
Yes.
I in my heart of hearts, I'm a quiet person, but the moment I choose to go out in the world, I know everybody around me who has a dog. We chat. I know their dogs' names. I know their names. I wave at people. I have that quality of my dad that I love people.
Yeah.
But then I come back inside to recharge. He went outside to recharge.
Mm-hmm.
My mother was a genuine hermit, but she loved observing people. She was always watching people, and that was her way of loving people, and she would reflect that back to them, what she'd seen in them. So I think I'm a combo plate of the two of them. I get recharged by being quiet and being inside, and then I go out and I'm so happy to connect. So it's a good combo plate for me. It works really well. And right now, when I'm someplace where I know no one, literally no one. Yeah. The fact that I have that quality of enjoying people, it really makes a difference, because those people that I see on my walk or my next door neighbor, they're the only people I see. I mean, It's been 5 months over 5 months since I've seen anyone I know.
Yeah. So the hermit quality comes in. It's a perfect time to be a hermit, because you actually enjoy being with yourself. And I'm the same way. I love doing things, but also I like my alone time and I like solitude. So I'm a mixture. I'm just like you. I'm a mixture of both. So I love the way you put that, an introverted extrovert.
And that's something that they taught me. My parents, they didn't get a lot of downtime. So if we would go on a vacation or we'd go to our beach time, and you got to remember, my dad was 51 when I was born. My mom was 45. So this kid, it was like, let's do this, let's do that, let's do. They were like, oh, could we like do our own thing, because this is our vacation too. And so they would send me down to the beach by myself or with the dog, and they'd say, you have to learn how to enjoy your own company. I think of them, and I'm so grateful for that every single day.
Yeah.
And I think I have immense compassion for people who weren't taught that, because right now people are going so stir crazy, and I get it. I mean, believe me, I lead tours all over the world. I do 40 speaking gigs or appearances a year. Everything was canceled. And so there's a part of me that, and I've been a nomad on the road. I don't have a home. This is an Airbnb that the guy, you know, was grateful to have someone in it because he wasn't going to get any rentals. Yeah. And so we worked out a deal, but this is the longest I've been in one place. It's got to be 15 years. I'm on the road usually 250 to 300 nights a year. And in the last 4 years, the not on the road has been staying with friends. I don't have a home. And so for me to be sitting here like this, I have my own form of stir crazy. And I look at people and I see them doing things that everyone's saying, please, can you just hold off? Can you try to, you know, calm down? Can you try to find different ways of doing things? And I think, you know, there, but for the grace of my parents telling me that I needed to learn how to enjoy my own company. And yesterday, I'm terrible at taking time off, just like my parents were, but I'm really making a point, because there are no vacations or distractions this year, to take my weekends off if I can. And the last few weekends I've been able to. And by yesterday at about 1 o'clock, I was like, oh my God, I've done I'm trying not to work, to rejuvenate, to recharge the batteries, because I'm a workaholic. And I'm thinking, is it night yet? Like, you know? And I thought to myself, well, okay, so what would they have said to you? And I got up and I got my camera and I went outside and I photographed birds. I love birds. I went for a long bike ride and I just went to some different places. I read some different things that I hadn't been reading. I had to really try to think differently. And that's something that they taught me. If you're always curious, you will never be bored. And so the moment I feel boredom coming up, I hear my dad going, bored? And then I know that I'm off track and I got to find a way to reconnect. And the world is just so full of amazing things. You asked me, is there anything he didn't do? Is there anything I haven't done? I'm sure both of us would say plenty, but compared to a lot of people, we've done a lot because we let our interests guide us. And my mother was the same way.
Yeah, very good. So definitely, it's great that both your biggest role models are mom and dad.
It is. And if you told me that when I was 20 or 25, I would have thought you were nuts. I would have said, no way. You know, when you're younger, you so want to be your own person. Yeah. And then the older you get, you realize that you're never really your own person. You're an amalgam of all the things that you've taken in.
Well, tell me about the daily practice of joy.
Well, the daily practice of joy was my way of dealing with the fact that I had become this workaholic. I grew up with workaholic parents, and workaholism is sort of the sanctioned American addiction. You know, we're witnessing that now. Everybody feels that the answer is to get back to work. And I know for a fact that I feel better when I'm working. And yet, if we just work to sort of assuage that voice in our head that isn't comfortable with ourselves, at some point the work doesn't feel good. And so right now, for example, this is an incredible opportunity for us to all look at what work means, what this economy looked like, what jobs look like. You know, our economy is built on the fact that the American economy is, I think, 70% consumption, buying, not making things, not creating things, not inventing things, not building things. And that's how this country grew. Yeah. And so the daily practice of joy for me was recognizing that I had lost the thing that both of my parents gave me, but my dad in particular, the pure and simple delight in being alive. That's the definition of joy. And I had to practice that. And that's what this whole last book, Living Love, is about. It's about practicing, as in showing up every single day, doing something instead of talking about doing something. I had to practice the pure and simple delight in being alive. And if I didn't do that, then I was just going through motions. And one day I was going to wake up and my time here was going to be done, and I wouldn't have shown up to my own heart. And I think that right now, in a time where everyone's saying, yeah, we know, we need jobs, we need to pay for things, we need to get back to work, but there are so many things. I remember my brother told me that when President Roosevelt died, and my dad did not grow up a Democrat, he grew up a Republican, and the first Democrat he voted for was Roosevelt. And he voted for Roosevelt because he saw that Roosevelt took this horrible problem that had existed, the Depression, and he approached it creatively. And he found these amazing ways for people to do things that my dad was blown away by, like, the Conservation Corps, or the one that my dad was most impressed with was the WPA, which was teaching people artistic skills that would benefit our country. Mm-hmm. And it was, people came out of that program with skills, with artistic skills, as artisans, as builders, as creators. Our country came out away with national parks and state parks and roads, and it was an incredible program. And my brother told me that when the radio came on and my dad heard that Roosevelt had died, he fell onto the sofa sobbing. And that tells me something about the quality of a leader, that he looks at a problem and sees an opportunity. And that's really something that my dad did. There were many times when his career was almost over, and instead of saying, oh, well, I'm too old to be an actor, I'm not relevant anymore, the kinds of things I was trained to do aren't what people are watching, he reinvented himself over and over again and found new genres and younger audiences. And that's what this time is for. If kids can't go back to school, what are some incredibly creative ways that we can figure out how to support the parents of those kids? And are some of those ways things that could employ people who don't have jobs, like virtual daycare? Are there community centers in empty buildings that could be created where kids could get food and be taught something in a way that is safe and social distancing? We need somebody like a Roosevelt to lead us in thinking that way. And I believe that my dad taught me that. The power of creativity and collaboration, that is the essence of leadership. And, it would have been foolhardy for me to say, oh, I don't like horror, I don't get it, I'm never going to like anything that's dark and violent. And if I had done that, I would have missed the opportunity to meet some people who've become my dearest friends and my greatest collaborators. And you sit us down and talk about movies, and I'm like, I don't even know why you like that. Can't we go watch a nice Bette Davis movie? And so if we just are so rigid in our idea of what life is, then we're never really living. And my brother once said about my dad that he loved life, and so life loved him back. But the first step is the loving of life.
I love that. Well, Frank Zappa had one of my favorite quotes. Your father had a lot of great quotes. I'm going to go over them later. But for Frank Zappa, he had a quote that perfectly goes with what you just said. An open mind is like a parachute. It only works when it's open. Or a mind is like a parachute. It only works when it's open. And so many people I know, like, I only like metal. I'm like, there's so much other great music out there. You got to like everything, or the same thing with movies and art. I mean, I like to experience as much as I can and learn, like, as I mentioned earlier. So I have the same attitude as you, and I know exactly where you're coming from. I wish there was more people like that, because like you said, there wouldn't be as much hatred. There'd be a lot more love, and there'd be a lot more understanding if more people were like that.
Well, and the funny thing is, the total irony is that I discovered that horror fans are, bar none, the loveliest people in the world. And I've heard that that's not necessarily true at other conventions, but horror conventions, there is just this kindness, and there's this sense of community, and I feel so much love at horror conventions. And so if I had just had this idea, horror is scary. It must attract scary people. And look, they're wearing scary makeup and they have, piercings
Yeah.
and, and spiky hair. I would have missed out on something that has been, talk about a daily practice of joy, one of the greatest joys of my life.
Yeah. Now, I go to a lot of conventions, and Chiller is, well, it was up until recently with the pandemic, every April and every October. And I go there, I see the same people every 6 months. And like you said, it's like family. Everybody's like, hey, how are you doing? We don't know each other, but we recognize each other and we start talking like we're old friends. So I've been to sci-fi conventions, and I personally say from my experience, you're right, it's not the same. The horror conventions has a different mentality that I've seen.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And so I really believe that the key to practicing joy or practicing anything that connects you to your heart is exactly what Frank Zappa said, having an
Yeah. Yeah, I love that.
open heart.
Now, as a minister, I know you married a couple not too far from here, because our mutual friend Cortland Hall runs the Witch's Dungeon in Connecticut, where I live. Tell me how that came about.
Well, I didn't go to seminary to become a minister. I really went to seminary because I had this idea that we're all told that there's one way. And I had this idea that if I had the opportunity to study all the traditions of the world, I would find that at the root of them all is the same thing, which is that love with the big L. And that's why I went to seminary. I went to seminary in New York, and I absolutely loved it. But at the end, I walked out an ordained minister. And one of the things we learned were all these rituals. And it was actually at Chiller, the final year of seminary, I happened to mention that I was a minister in my talk. I have no idea why. It's not something I particularly talk about a lot. And this couple who I met a few times, they'd come and heard me talk. They came up and they said, we always come to hear you talk, and we're getting married next year. And right before you started to talk, we looked at each other and say, oh my God, wouldn't it be amazing if Victoria could marry us? And then you told us you're a minister. Do you do weddings? And I said, yeah. So they were my first wedding. I loved it. I've never been married. I've been in a lot of weddings, but weddings were never like my thing. I love doing weddings. And so I think I told a few people how much I enjoyed it and how much I loved it. And since then, I've done a lot of weddings. In fact, I keep meaning, I just haven't done it yet, to put up on my website that, during this time, I'd be happy to do some virtual weddings for people, because I absolutely love doing weddings. And that one was really, really amazing, because it was at Witch's Dungeon right around Halloween. And they were showing old movies. And what I love to do is create a ceremony that really reflects who the couple are. Mm-hmm. And it's really, really powerful for me. And I've married people now all over the world. And it's been a really beautiful thing, because you feel forever like you're a part of their life.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I'm engaged, so I might be talking to you after the podcast.
Awesome. Congratulations, by the way.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I think it would be pretty cool to be married by Victoria Price.
It is just such a gift. And I'll tell you a funny story. So on that first wedding, it was in Asbury Park, New Jersey. And I'd never been there, always wanted to go there. And the day of the wedding, it just bucketed rain. I went out, I walk every day. I walk 5 to 10 miles a day. And I was just drenched. I don't think I even took my dog with me, because it was that kind of bucketing rain. But it was this cool old hotel. So I ended up spending a lot more time indoors. And by the time the wedding started, I was like so glad to get out and do something and see people. So the place where the ceremony was a big room with really high ceilings. I mean, those ceilings must have been, they were gigantic high, like stories high. Yeah. And we talked about it, and I decided to mention that one of the ways that we came together was through love. And one of those things was the love of my dad. And I literally had just said that, the love of my dad, when there was this noise. And it was, I don't even know how to describe the noise, but it wasn't like a building creak. And it was a noise like the entire audience looked up. We all were aware of that there was a response to what I just said. And all I could say was, hey, Dad,
Yep.
because that's what it felt like. It felt like, yep, and I'm here.
Well, you mentioned the L word a lot in this. So tell me about the Capital L podcast.
Yes. Well, interesting. I always feel like I like to try anything. And when the pandemic hit, I felt like a lot of the things I've written over the years had messages that I felt that I should get back out there, that I'd like to share. And so the idea behind capital L is that it's the only capital we need, love. That if we do what we love, I do something called holistic branding. I work with clients, people who want to do something and are unsure how to proceed. They find their authentic voice. They need to find a way of getting it out into the world. They don't know how to do it. Do they use social media? Do they build a website? How do they create themselves out there? So this holistic branding is sort of like spiritual direction meets social media. I work with them to really articulate it, and then I build their websites. I create their social media campaigns. I do all their graphic design and logos. I work with them on getting their voice out there through blogging and all sorts of things. And I really, really love doing it. And inevitably, when we start and things get rolling, I have a client right now, and he really he's very disillusioned with the field that he's in, and he wanted to find the courage to begin to write about that, not sort of as a complaint, but kind of to raise the level of conversation and say, we can do better, people. So he's written we launched the website less than a month ago. He's written 3 or 4 blogs that he's sent out. They're on the website, but he's sent out in email form. And I've never seen anything like it. Like, the response is amazing. People keep writing back going, oh my God, that's fantastic. I love what you're writing. Keep writing. I really need to read this. And he's like, I don't know what to make of this. Other people that I've worked with, painters and things like that, they're like, people are buying my paintings. And ever since I started working with you, and I said, it's not me. It's that the moment you recognize that you got to get all those naysaying voices out of your head, and you got to really trust that you have something to share. And then when you share from your heart, people love that energy. And so what they want to buy or participate in or connect with is that energy. It's the same reason people love my dad.
Yeah.
People who didn't even like horror movies love my dad, because he had that energy. And when people connect to that energy, because we all have it, then things begin to shift. And that's why I say capital L is the only capital we need, love. And so I started this podcast, and I want to share this because I think it's really good for people to hear. Now, I don't listen to podcasts. I listen to audiobooks all the time, but I don't listen to podcasts. I know there's some that people really love. I just never got into it. I don't know why. I listen to many things, just not podcasts. And so I kind of did it because I didn't know how else to get the stories back out there. And about 6 episodes in, I realized that it was always the last thing on my list. It wasn't something I enjoyed doing. And as a result, I don't think people read my blog all the time. People really connect with all different things I do. And that just sort of, for all of us, kind of fell flat. And I thought, I'm going to stop and really think about it. And I began researching podcasts and finding out what people like about them and finding out what I liked about them. And so I'm actually ready to move into a season 2 of Capital L, but it's going to be very different. And I share that because one of the greatest lessons I learned from both of my parents about succeeding is that you have to be willing to fail. Because
exactly.
if you don't try something, then you're never going to know if it's really for you or it's not for you. And failing isn't actually failing. It's an opportunity to shift your perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I'm excited. I'm really excited to start this new incarnation of it and do something that feels much more from my own heart, something I would be excited about doing.
Right.
And
Make
I'm doing these things called Follow Spot Live with my partner, my business partner, Peter Fuller in London. He runs the Vincent Price Legacy UK. And we host these live events. We've taken August off, but we were doing 2 to 3 a month from March on. And they're live events, Follow Spot Live, with incredible people. We've had Roger Corman and Elizabeth Shepard and David Frankham. And we've showed premieres of films that haven't been out, and we've done a bunch of fun Vincent Price events, and we have some cool ones coming up. We've got Butch Patrick and Sarah Douglas and all these Dennis O'Hare, really cool people coming up. We're really excited about it. But Peter is the film buff. I'm like the hostess with the mostess and the color commentator. Peter is the film buff, and I keep saying to him, I love how good you are at this and how much fun you are having doing this. And he said, I'm loving it, because he quit. He took sort of early retirement. I forget what it's called in England, with the idea, because he and I lead these tours all over the world, that we had a bunch of tours we were going to be leading this year. And he took his early retirement like the day before. I mean, it had been planned. It started the day before England went into lockdown. So he took his early retirement and was locked down. And very quickly it became clear we weren't going to be leading any tours anywhere. And Peter and I bond because he has that same joy in life as my dad did. So instead of going like, geez, I could be working from home, he's having the best time. He's working on cookbook. He's working on all these different projects. He and I are doing Follow Spot Live, and we'll resume the tours when the world opens back up. Yeah. But watching him have so much joy made me realize that there's parts of myself right now that I've been so focused on the Vincent Price legacy and what the fans want, that maybe there's part of the things that I'm a fan about that I haven't been honoring. So that's the kind of thing that we can all learn during this time. One of the worst times of my dad's life was when he was gray listed during the McCarthy era, and he didn't work for a long time, and he loved to work. And my mother, I think, was looking at him. I mean, they lived in a 9,000 square foot house, so they weren't on top of each other, but he was miserable. And my mother was definitely somebody who saw a problem and had ideas for how to shift it. She was just this incredible innovator. And so she said to him, you always say that if you had time to write, you'd write a book. You have time to write a book. And he wrote this book that ended up being published called I Like What I Know. That led to a ton of other books. For the rest of his life, he wrote. And he always said that was one of the happiest times of his life, working on that book, at one of the unhappiest times of his life. So similarly, at a time where he couldn't get hired and he was terrified that he would never work again, he poured himself into something he had always loved, which was writing, and writing about the thing he probably loved most in the world, which was art. He did both of those things, and out of that, a whole new world opened up for him. It opened up, just a tremendous number of things for him. And so I think that's exactly what we all need to be doing. And I'm looking at that for myself too.
I agree with you completely. There's no way I can even top what you just said. But I want to ask you, you mentioned gray listed. What's the difference between gray listed and blacklisted, and how did that come about with him?
Well, I believe that blacklists were people who were specifically targeted. The studios were told not to hire them. Many of them were called up in front of HUAC. Mm-hmm. And I believe gray lists were these much larger, more amorphous lists of people who were suspected of being communists. The list he was on was called the pre-war anti-Nazi sympathizers. So what that meant was, if before we declared war on Hitler, you were against Hitler, theoretically a good thing, you must have been a communist. And my dad, like many, many creative people in the 30s, was very active in Spanish Civil War relief. He was actively fighting against, by raising money, by raising his voice, against fascism in Europe, as in Franco. And that aligned him with many people who were communists in the 30s, and he was targeted as a communist. And the irony, of course, of all of that is that everybody missed the whole point, that people were banding together across political, divisions, and standing up to something that needed to be stood up against, which was fascism. But of course, in that very simplistic black and white thinking of the McCarthy era, that made you a communist. But Eleanor Roosevelt was on the pre-war anti-Nazi sympathizer list, but you were encouraged to not hire those people. And all of a sudden there were people who just literally, the well dried up. And my dad was one of them.
And how did he get off that list?
Well, that's an interesting story. I usually gloss over that story. It's all in the biography, but I gloss over that story because it's a longer story, but I will tell it because it's interesting. And it sort of, again, is one of those lessons for us all. So when I was in high school, I learned about the McCarthy era in AP US history, and I just was fascinated by it. From the time I was a little girl, I was very, very outspoken about what I felt was right and what I felt was wrong. When we were taken to the White House, in my childhood mind, I thought President Nixon was responsible for all the people who had died in the Vietnam War. Of course, I didn't understand that the Vietnam conflict had been going on long before Nixon. I thought Nixon was a bad man, and I told my father I would refuse to shake his hand, and my father said, I don't care if he's a bad man or a good man, he's the President of the United States, and you're a 10-year-old girl, so you will be shaking his hand. And I remember thinking to myself how kind he was, because I wanted him to have horns and a tail and, work. And he was so lovely. He stopped and he talked to me and he asked me about myself. And, he was kind to me. And,
yeah.
And that was one of those great lessons of childhood that, people aren't characters in fairy tales. We're all complex. And of course, the one who I thought was a cold fish was his wife, who, was going through a lot. She was struggling. So, found out about all of that later. So I had that in me, that real clear sense of there's right and there's wrong. And so when I read about the McCarthy era in high school, I was just fascinated and I wanted to ask my dad all about it. So he began telling me about it. And then it came even closer to home, because in the picture in our high school textbook, there was a picture of McCarthy with two of his henchmen. And one of them had the same last name as the girl, she was 12, senior in high school, who was the head of our student council. And I was on student council. I was a year younger. I was in 11th grade. And I thought, wonder if that's the same. Now, it wasn't an uncommon name, but as I read all about it, I found out that he was her dad. And so here was this girl who I really liked. I was on, student council with her. She was really good at running the school. And her dad was like one of the bad guys. So then I was really interested in asking my dad. And, he gave this very layered thing, but he was also angry about it. He said how many of his friends had lost their lives, lost their livelihoods, fled the country. And he told me all of that, and told me then that he was on the gray list. And I asked him how he'd gotten off the list. And over the years, I got a little bit more of the story. And finally, by the time he died, I had understood that he had met, as he referred to them, some nice Republican ladies through the art world. And he asked them if any of them could help him get his name off that list. And that's how it happened. Fine. Cut to, he's now gone. And it's my job to clean out his house. And now what I want to say is that all happened in the 1950s. And between the 1950s and the house that I was cleaning out, there were at least 3 other houses. But behind his air conditioner in a closet that nobody ever went into, but I, was making sure there was nothing in there, I found this manila envelope. And in it were all the documents he had signed to clear his name. And that, first of all, blew me away. First of all, he had saved them. And most of his documents had gone to either Yale or the Library of Congress. He has 2 archives, one at Yale, one at the Library of Congress. But he'd saved it. And over the years, I was very political. He would constantly, if I was on my way to some rally, say, don't get your name on a list. He was always really scared. And so here he had saved this, and I knew the moment I saw it that he'd saved it for that reason. It was always something he could pull out and say, but my name has been cleared. Then I read the document, and I was stunned. And I didn't know what to think. As it all turned out, I had, I was going to get together with Eddie Albert, who was like my surrogate dad growing up, my Uncle Eddie, a few days later. And we went and had lunch. And we were sitting out in his beautiful garden, and I adored Eddie and Aunt Margot and his two kids, Maria and Edward. They were like family. I loved them so much. And I said to Eddie that I had been so upset because what my dad had basically said was, anyone who pleads the fifth is un-American, which I knew he did not believe. And there were many other things he said, not many, 3, that I knew he did not believe. And I was like, and I said to Eddie, I said, how could he have said that? How could he have signed his name to something that he did not believe just to clear his name? Now, what I have to tell you is that Eddie was like my dad, just this bright light, so full of joy.
Yeah.
And it was like this black cloud came over his head, and he looked at me and he pointed his finger at me. He said, don't you dare judge the actions of anyone else if you aren't them. If you haven't walked in their shoes, if you weren't there, he said, do you know? And he went and he told me about every single one of his friends who had had something horrible happen to them because of it. And then he told me something that I had never known. Now, as bright of a light as Eddie was, his wife, Margot, honestly, if I think joy, number 1 is my dad, but right next to her and number 2 is Margot. Margot just, I can't even explain to you how she lit up a space. She had come to the United States from Mexico. She was the niece of the band leader, Xavier Cugat. She was a one-name actress before there were many of those, Margot. And she appeared in films like The Lost Horizons. She had this incredible career. She was a singer and a dancer, and she was just beautiful. And she was so full of light. But by the time I knew her, she wasn't acting anymore. And she was very active in a group in Los Angeles called Plaza de la Raza, which was a Mexican cultural center. And she was just this beautiful, beautiful, bright person. She died a few years before, by the time was having lunch with Eddie. And Eddie said, Margot was blacklisted. And I was like, what? And he said, yeah. She never acted again. And that shut me up.
Yeah.
Because I all of a sudden understood so many things about Margot that I'd never understood, not the least of which was, why she was so passionate about her advocacy for Mexican Americans. But I thought, well, oh, right. What would I have done? Me, miss, how could he have? And so that, frankly, right now still colors a lot of the choices that I make, because it's very easy for all of us sitting in our literal armchairs in our literal living rooms, most of us not going out that much, to judge this or that or this or that. But if we're not walking a mile in other people's shoes, we cannot judge. There's a difference between judgment and discernment. We can discern from our hearts and from common sense and from an idea about the greater good, what we maybe should or shouldn't be doing in the world or saying, but judging gets us nowhere.
Beautifully said. Now, as I mentioned before, I've met you at Chiller several times, and what impresses me the most is you're one of the few celebrities that does not charge for pictures. So tell me how a conversation that your father had with actress Helen Hayes helped make your decision on not to charge.
Well, here's the interesting thing, right? My dad was a very young actor, and he was in his first play with the First Lady of the American Theater, and people were coming up to him, and Hollywood was offering him $1 million movie contracts, and Helen Hayes really gave him sound advice. She told him to go out and learn his craft. She told him to learn how to become an actor, and one of the things she said was, never forget that an actor is a public servant. And my dad never forgot that. He never said no to an autograph. The idea of charging for an autograph would have been ludicrous. And he understood that if you don't have an audience, then you're just somebody who's talking to yourself. You know, an actor requires that connection between them and their audience. It's not you just, I mean, I'm sitting here talking to you, and the ideas that are coming out of this exchange are very different than the afternoon I would be having if I was sitting here just typing on my computer keys. The exchange between people is the spark of life. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, this all happened well before the conventions became a thing that they did. And so had my dad gone to conventions, I'm guessing that he probably would have done something similar to what I do, which is that I have certain things that I bring with me. And if you buy one of those things, I'll sign anything for you. And I always make sure that I have something on my table that's $5 or less. So, you know, because some of the conventions really prefer it if you ask people to sign. But for me, I really feel like the bottom line is if somebody can't afford something and it's really important to them, that connection is what matters the most. And so, you know, the world isn't exactly the same as it was when my dad was not asking for money for autographs, because nobody was asking money for autographs, and he would have just thought it was ridiculous. I mean, it would be sort of like saying you were going to go play Wimbledon with a wooden racket, you know, and say, well, that's how Rod Laver won, and he was maybe the greatest of all time. Well, yeah, but you're probably not going to beat Roger Federer with a wooden racket. I don't care how good you are. So, you know, everything changes, but the impetus behind it for me is still that I don't want to do anything that makes, that creates a barrier between me and a heart-based connection with another person.
Well, I love the fact that both you and your father know, you know, the audience. You're nothing without the audience. And, you know, if nobody's going to see his movies, then he wouldn't have a career. So I love the fact that both of you appreciate where you came from, and the people there are, there's no barrier between you and the audience. And I've noticed that for the last like 3 or 4 years when I first met you, and I thank you for that. But your father, Vincent Price, as I mentioned before, is extremely talented, but he was also extremely smart. He graduated from Yale with a degree in English and a minor in art history, and he taught for a year as well. So how do you go from that to performing at Orson Welles' Mercury Theater?
Well, you know, I think my dad, it's fair to say, as I would say as well, neither of us would have gotten into the kinds of schools we got into now. It is a lot more competitive. My dad's dad had gone to Yale. My dad's brother had gone to Yale. And yes, he was smart, but the kinds of kids who get into, you know, when I got into Yale, and I mean, I think I'm perfectly intelligent, and neither of us would get into Yale now. Not a chance. But I think that he always valued education and learning. And so the connection with Orson Welles, you know, was an obvious one, because Orson Welles was taking classic plays and doing a modern twist on them. And there was something very smart and compelling about that. And they were ensemble pieces. My dad met some of his dearest friends, Joseph Cotton, Norman Lloyd. He married his first wife, whom he worked with during that too. But the funny connection that is really great is that my dad's dad and Orson Welles' dad went to high school together and were great friends, and did these amazing things together. So did their own sort of fun theatrical things. I think Orson Welles' dad became a doctor, and my grandfather was a businessman, but really an entrepreneur. He was a creative businessman, and so the connection wasn't that big of a leap. But the real leap for him was allowing himself to believe he could be an actor, because he never got cast in any plays when he was younger, and he had no way of believing that this was anything more than a pipe dream. But again, I really feel very strongly that if you love something so much, and and you want to be a part of it, if you're willing to release the ego of that and just show up to the love of it, then you get to do it. You know, my dad nobody ever put Vincent Price in the same breath as Laurence Olivier or John Gielgud. And yet Laurence Olivier and John Gielgud and Alec Guinness, all of those actors became dear friends of my dad's. Nobody ever said, you know, Vincent Price is the greatest actor ever to have trod the boards. He never won an Oscar, but there were actors who were more famous than my dad who have been forgotten except by fans of Turner Classic Movies. And here's my dad, who is still so loved. And so I think, I'm not saying my dad was a bad actor. He wasn't. He was a dedicated actor. And some of the things that I saw him do that weren't the sort of fun things that he tossed away in some way, were incredibly good, incredibly powerful. His one-man show where he played Oscar Wilde, one of the best one-man show I've ever seen, and I've seen a lot. Powerful, fantastic. He knew how to act. But what set my dad apart, and I think has given him the longevity that he had, was his zest for living. And so when people say there will never be another Vincent Price, they mean that there was something unique about how he approached life that people are still drawn to, that people are still compelled by. And that's why his name, I think, has still more play than somebody, you know, let's say like Robert Taylor, who was a vastly bigger star than my dad was for the first 20 years of my dad's career, and handsome and all of those things. But Robert Taylor, you know, I would say the number of younger people who know who Robert Taylor is vastly smaller than the number of people who know who Vincent Price is.
Oh, I agree with you 100%. Now, you mentioned your grandfather. So tell me about Dr. Price's baking powder.
Well, that's my great-grandfather's.
Oh, great-grandfather.
Yeah, my great-grandfather was also Vincent Price. So there were 3 Vincents.
Okay.
My brother also. And, but he was a homeopathic doctor in the mid-1800s, and he couldn't get much work. And so he basically fooled around in the kitchen because his mother wasn't a very good cook, and she was particularly known for these biscuits that gave everybody indigestion. They were just leaden, apparently, and that's how he invented baking powder. And then he did what a lot of people did. He went west to make his fortune.
Oh, and the rest is history. Now, I mentioned many times, you know, your father's a Renaissance man. I'm probably going to mention it a couple more times. What impressed me doing my research is that he bought his first Rembrandt at age 12. So at age 12, he already appreciated classic art.
Well, he fell in love with the visual arts through a book that his older sister had left behind. She, like a lot of upper class girls of that era, learned about the arts, music and art history. But he was the one who really loved it. And for the first 17, 18 years of his life, he dreamed of being an artist. But he felt he wasn't good enough to do that. And so that's why he became an art historian. He studied art history.
Yeah. Then he was also the commissioner of the Indian Arts and Craft Board.
He did. Yeah, he was invited by the Department of the Interior, which is part of the U.S. government, to serve on the Indian Arts and Crafts Board. He served on it for 15 years, promoting and preserving Native American arts, making sure that fakes weren't being sold, that Native American artists were being protected, and their work was being promoted and popularized. And that was a big passion for him. He was fascinated with Native American culture. That began as a little boy. He grew up near St. Louis, and St. Louis along the Mississippi, all along the Mississippi, there are many what are called mound cultures, Native American cultures who built their cities on these big mound dwellings. And Cahokia, the Cahokia culture and the Cahokia mound dwellings are right across from St. Louis. And he was taken to play there. And then he went to summer camp in the Southwest. He had all these amazing experiences that taught him about Native American culture and then Native American art. So that was a passion his entire life from the time he was a little boy. And he was well known for being a staunch advocate when that was not something people were that aware of Native American art and culture.
Yeah. He was also an art consultant for Sears and Roebuck.
Yes, he was. And that came about sort of hilariously. They were changing their image, kind of revamping it to make themselves less of a catalog company and more of a high-end department store with bricks and mortar. And they were hiring spokespeople, and they hired all these people who were known for different things. And they wanted to hire him because he was well known for being an advocate of the arts. They wanted to hire him to be the spokesman for the art program, but he wasn't that impressed with the art that Sears sold. So he declined, but it was my mother who said, "Are you crazy? This is Sears Roebuck. You know, if you could do something for Sears, what would it be?" And he said, "Well, if they'd let me buy all the art, then sure, I'd sell it." And that's what happened. He ended up buying an immense amount of art, and people could buy Rembrandts and Dalís and Vuillards and Andrew Wyeths and emerging artists, all on their Sears credit card with a money-back guarantee. And so many people bought their first piece of art through Sears Roebuck. And he was a popular, he really felt that art was not the province of the elite. It shouldn't just belong in the houses of people who, like him, had gone to Yale, that everybody should be able to afford to own art. And so that was something that allowed that to happen. And it was one of the great gifts of his lifetime.
This story, I love it. I want you to tell my viewers about this. Producer Samuel Arkoff, when he was working with him, he thought that Vincent was living the lap of luxury, and he found out he was living in a hotel room so he could save money to buy art. That's how dedicated he was to collecting art.
Oh yeah, and he would also, all of his contracts, he was a lecturer. He would lecture on the visual arts all over the country. He was the second most popular lecturer after Eleanor Roosevelt. And
Wow.
his contract said that he would get a first-class ticket, and he would trade that first-class ticket in and fly coach, even though his legs didn't really fit in the coach seat. And because he just thought it was ridiculous, you know, that all that money was being spent on a first-class ticket, and he could buy art with that too. Yeah, he was, you know, he was a very simple person in many ways. He was not a grand person by any stretch of the imagination. And, you know, I think it was, he grew up wealthy, but he grew up during World War I and the Depression, and he grew up, you know, as a man who understood that he was not going to be given things and that he had to go out and make his own living. So when I went through a lot of money stuff when I was younger, he just had the hardest time understanding the sort of the way that my generation seemed to be more entitled than his. And he tried to teach me to be a very humble person. And I'm so grateful for that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's why people can relate to him. Like people that aren't making millions of dollars, they can say, you know, Vincent's one of us. He's not up there and we're down here. He was,
Right.
you know, and so I think that's one of many reasons why he's so likable. I love this next story, and I want you to tell my viewers this one as well. Edward G. Robinson, the great actor, he helped save your father's art collection from a fire.
Yeah. So my parents would throw these wonderful New Year's Eve parties, and they would have like a quartet playing music so people could dance. And they were, you know, always beautiful food, and it was really wonderful. And they were small parties, but they always had their closest friends. And at one of them, that New Year's Eve, there was a fire in nearby Bel Air. And all the canyons, my parents lived in a canyon, were evacuated. So they did all those things that you do when you think there's a fire. My brother was told to dump all the silver in the swimming pool because that would save the silver. And you grab the things you don't want to lose. And my mother told this story. So they had this incredible African mask, Yoruba mask, that my mother knew that my father, and both of them really felt very strongly about. It was gigantic. And there were like 100 stairs literally leading down to the driveway. And so she's going down the front stairs with this gigantic mask, and my dad rushes by her with something. And when they get down to the car, she's like, what did you have? You know, this whole art collection. And he said, the caviar and a parking ticket. because that caviar was so damn expensive. And, you know, it was like he had been so appalled at how expensive the caviar was. And a parking ticket, because if he didn't pay it on time, then he would get charged, you know, a fee. So
Yes.
my mother always told that story on him. But long story short, they blocked all the, you know, they had to leave and they blocked anyone from coming up. So Edward G. Robinson heard about the fire and he knew the party was happening. And so he got to the corner of Sunset and Beverly Glen where they were blocking everybody. And he said to the policeman, "You have to let me through." And they said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Robinson, we can't, you know, unless you live there." And he said, "I have to go help my friend Vincent. You know, he has one of the great art collections in the world and we can't let it burn up." So they let him through. And along with him, they also let through all these members of the UCLA football team, because my dad was also on the UCLA Arts Council and president of it for a while. And seeing that art collection became required viewing for the UCLA art history students. They opened their house almost like a museum to them. And so these football players knew that my dad had this collection and they went up and helped carry all the art out. So they loaded, you know, everything into Edward G. Robinson's car and my parents' cars. And so fortunately the fire never hit their house.
Oh, good. And then we have the Vincent Price Art Museum in LA.
Yes. So that's an incredible museum. My parents started it with 90 pieces from their collection in the 1950s. And it has gone on to be an extraordinary museum. All I can say is, if you have an opportunity to go to Los Angeles, it is at East Los Angeles College. It is the heart and center of that community. Again, you know, art in Los Angeles was very much the province of the elite. And my mother in particular, along with my dad, really felt that this was where their energy should lie. My dad had befriended the art teacher there and was doing a lot with the student body already, but both the LA County Art Museum and UCLA wanted my parents to give pieces of their collection. It was my mother who said, "We have to give it here because this is where it's needed. This is America." You know, she went to a graduation speech my dad gave there and she looked out at the audience and it was, you know, Latino and Latina and Asian American and African American. You know, my mother was an immigrant and that was the America that she loved, the America that invited people from all different countries and said, "You have something to contribute to this country and to our world." And so she wanted all of those students to have access to art, and it became the passion of their lives. My dad, whenever he traveled, would bring back things for that collection. It's an incredible collection, and now it's gone on to be very prestigious, and yet it is free and it is open to the public, and it is right there. You know, you can walk. You know, it's a beautiful building, gorgeous building, and it's right across the street from Carl's Jr., you know, it is not pretentious.
Cannot wait. I think I have to make a special trip just to see that museum.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Well, now let's move on to his acting. He always wanted to be a character actor, which surprised me, but the studio wanted him to be a leading man. Why was that?
Because he was so handsome.
No, but why didn't he want to be a leading actor? Most people dream of being the star, and your father said, "No, I just like being a character actor."
Because the character actors have all the fun parts, you know. I think
that is true.
There's something about being a leading man that felt fake to him. It didn't feel like who he was. He didn't see himself as some handsome leading man. He saw himself as an interesting person, and he wanted to play those interesting people, and those were the character parts.
Okay. And let's talk about the Roger Corman films. I know you recently interviewed him. And what I found most interesting about that was when he worked with Peter Lorre and Boris Karloff, there were some minor disagreements about acting styles. Peter Lorre loved improvisation. Boris Karloff was by the book, stick to the script, and Vincent could either read the script or do some improv. So tell my viewers how he helped Roger Corman ease tensions on the set.
Well, I think Roger quickly realized that it was going to be a challenge because Peter didn't memorize one word of the script and Boris was very by the book. Mm-hmm. And so Roger was like, "What are we going to do?" And he called a meeting. And really, my dad became that go-between because my dad could do both. Yeah. And Roger says that by the end of the movie, Boris, because I think, you know, let's face it, all of us just do what we know. That's part of what we're learning during this time, that we're going to have to actually start learning how to do things that we don't know how to do and be people that we don't think we know how to be. And so my dad had always been that kind of person. He'd always been that person who could dive in here and dive in there and felt comfortable. But Boris, I mean, this was 1 or 2 years before Peter's death and 4 or 5 before Boris's death. They'd had long careers doing what they did really well. Boris was a by the book, excellent actor, and Peter was a not by the book, fly by the seat of his pants, excellent actor. It's like the old dog new tricks. But the thing that happened was my dad was that peacemaker, and because he could do both, and Boris learned how to improvise, and Peter came a little better prepared, and it was incredible. And Bill Hader did this character of my dad on Saturday Night Live, and I think that he captured something in his humor of my dad always being the host, the convivial host, but always just trying to hold it all together. My dad was somebody who wanted everybody to get along. And so he didn't really care if you were a great actor or weren't a great actor. What he cared about was that everybody showed up on the set and got along, found a way to connect with one another. And very few people he ever said anything negative about. My sense was that what he disliked about them was that they weren't those kind of people. They didn't want to, they wanted to go back to their room, or they were focused on whatever they were focused on. He wanted, David Frankham tells the story, he pulled David Frankham out of his trailer one day and he said, I love a convivial set, so come on out and be a part of it. He wanted connection.
Well, he was really good friends with Peter Lorre. From what I read, he gave the eulogy at his funeral.
Yes, he did. But I think they became friends later in life, and that's one of the great things about my dad was that, friendship for him could be his entire life, or it could be of the moment. If you sat down with my dad and he talked to you, you were his friend.
Sticking with Roger Corman for now, I found this interesting. The House of Usher, he almost couldn't get that made because the studio said, there's no monster. What are we going to do? What's the monster? How did Roger Corman make that work?
He said the house was the monster.
I like that. That's an easy fix.
Yes.
And that led to more Poe adaptations: Tales of Terror, The Raven, The Tomb of Ligeia, The Mask of the Red Death, and The Pit and the Pendulum, which were all great movies, very well done, very well acted. Was your father a big fan of Poe?
Oh, absolutely. He felt that Poe was one of the great original American voices, maybe the first American creative voice that was respected in Europe. Poe's writing influenced generations of European writers afterwards. And it wasn't that there weren't, superb writers before Poe, but, we were this kind of cultural wasteland, America. And Poe writing in the early, 1800s, so many writers admired him, European writers, and were influenced by him. And so he was, my dad felt, the great original American voice, and to have his name associated with him forever was something that really was important to him.
Now, as a child, did you ever visit the set of any of his movies?
I did, yeah.
That must have been fun.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. The thing for me was that my parents really wanted me to have a normal childhood. So I wasn't pulled out of school for this or that. And the things that were fun for me often were the few times that they did sort of special movie star kind of things with me. They were the things that they knew I would like. Like one of my birthday presents, I got to go meet Lassie. Lassie. I got to go to the ranch out in the middle of nowhere where Red Weatherwax trained Lassie and all kinds of other animals. And I had a birthday cake out there. It's just me, my parents, Red Weatherwax, the animals. And I got to meet all the animals. There was a point where there's a picture of me and all these little ducklings are imprinting on me and following me, and all these pictures of me and Lassie. What kid is going to care more about who, I don't know, Cary Grant than Lassie? And, I got to meet Lassie. And so, there were obviously stars that I cared about. Lucille Ball was, I got to meet Lucille Ball when my dad did a Here's Lucy episode, and I was this huge I Love Lucy fan. So, it wasn't that all animals were better than people, but where my parents really kind of let me reap the benefits of growing up as the kid of someone famous, almost all of them had to do with meeting animals.
Well, when you were on the set of Theater of Blood, you got out of the car to being approached by people with no teeth, open sores. Then they began pawing at you until your dad jumped out and said, "Hey, that's my daughter. Leave her alone." What was that all about?
That was his practical joke.
I love it. But the thing is, you did not realize that for years that was a practical joke. He never told you?
I never saw the movie. No, I think he thought I got it. I was a fairly naive child.
How old were you on that set?
9 or 10 maybe.
So all these people in makeup, you had no idea. You thought that was real?
Yes. Well, they came outside and started pawing at me. They were all the homeless people on the set.
How did you find out? How did you find out years later?
The penny dropped when I finally saw the movie. I don't remember.
That is funny. Now, we mentioned your father was graylisted. His first movie, his return to acting, was House of Wax. It was the first 3D film to land in the year's top 10 at the North American box office. There's an interesting story about that. I want you to tell my viewers the director and why it's amazing that the movie was made in 3D.
Well, the director, Andre de Toth, only had one eye. And if you only have one eye, you can't see in 3D. You have to have two eyes to see 3D. And my dad always felt that that is part of what made that movie have such legs to be as long lasting, because it wasn't a gimmicky 3D movie. He made a movie that had a great story. That was his concern.
Yeah. Well, I love those movies where you're like, here's the pizza. You're like, they'll do anything to make, something come right at you. So yeah, the House of Wax is great because it's the movie, and they're not even really thinking, but you're not even thinking about the 3D, but they're not using all these gimmicks to show you, like, watch out for this, and things are coming at them. I love the movie, and I thought it was great. And that's a great movie to start your acting career again with.
Yes.
I found this surprising, and tell my viewers about this. He once turned down $1 million contract right before the Depression. Why was that?
That was when Helen Hayes said to him, go out and learn your craft. She asked him how many, things he'd done, and did he feel like he really was a good actor? And he was very humble about it. How can I be? I've hardly done a thing. He'd been in like 1.5 plays. Wow. So she urged him to turn down a movie contract and keep acting in the theater to learn how to be that kind of actor.
I love it. Because, sometimes people will take the first big payday and the movie's not that good and they'll never get another role. But your father, believed in himself, and he's like, I'll wait for something else. And that's very impressive, especially at that time when the Depression's right around the corner.
It was actually during the Depression.
Oh,
but
during.
The really great thing that he learned during that time was that he could act in the theater. And so whenever things got tough, he always went back to the theater. That was where he got his acting legs under him all the time.
Another great director he worked with was William Castle. He was the master of gimmicks. In House on Haunted Hill, he filmed it in Emergo, which was a skeleton with red lighted eye sockets attached to a wire, and it floated over the audience. And then The Tingler, which is my favorite, it was filmed in Percepto. Yes. With that film, he purchased military surplus wing de-icers, which consisted of vibrating motors and had crews attached them to the bottom of some of the seats.
Yeah. He was a great showman, William Castle.
Yeah, and you could tell your father's having so much fun. Well, pretty much everything he does. Yeah. Now, is this true? When they were filming The Fly, especially my favorite scene when the fly's in the spider web yelling, "Help me! Help me!" They had to do so many takes because your father could not stop laughing.
None of them could. It was just so ridiculous.
But it's so great.
If you look, you can see my dad just holding it together.
Oh, really? I'm going to have to rewatch that one again.
Yeah.
And he did lots of television as well. He was featured on 900 episodes of Hollywood Squares alone.
Exactly.
That is such a fun show, especially the ones in the 70s. They had so many great actors on there, like,
he loved doing it. It was fun. They would film, he'd film 5 in a day, 3 before lunch. Then they'd all go to the commissary and eat lunch together, and 2 after lunch. And, my dad loved people. He got to be with all kinds of fun people, and 9 other people plus the contestants, and he enjoyed it.
I heard somewhere, I can't remember where, but they were saying that when some of the people went to lunch, they drank a lot, and they came back to film some other ones, and they were so trashed. I'm not sure if that, your father was in some of those episodes where some of the other people, I'm thinking like Paul Lynde and some of the other people.
I'm sure that's true.
Yeah. They were always having a great time, though. Now, your father, my favorites, though, for TV, it had to be the Brady Bunch and Batman, where he played Egghead with all of his puns. Exactly. Exquisite. I love that. And of course, the Muppet Show. So not only did this help him stay relevant, but he did this for another reason. What was that?
For me.
Yep. He's such a great
I
dad.
was a little kid when he was in his 50s, and he didn't want to be some old fuddy-duddy dad. And he also wanted my friends to know who he was. So, here I was in school. Eartha Kitt's daughter went to school with me, and her mom played, Catwoman, and there were all sorts of other kids who were on TV shows, and kids whose parents worked on these TV shows, and they were all so much younger than my parents. And he wanted my friends to know who he was, and me to get to see him on things, because I wasn't about to be going to the horror movies. And so it was a way of him staying relevant, but also it was more than just me. He loved kids. He loved that, he always felt that adults we get more conservative as we get older. We get more restricted, and, kids are just so, curious and interested in the world, I mean, I watch these kids on these scooters. When they get really bored during this time, they go up and down the hill on these scooters that I'm on, and they're having so much fun. And I think to myself, why aren't I doing that? Because in my head now, I think, oh, it would just be a scooter. How much fun is that? You go down, you walk back up, you go down, but you're a kid. It's so much fun. How do we lose that?
I know. Well, I love the fact that he kept that. And one of my favorite clips I was rewatching again was when he was on the Muppet Show and Kermit took over for Johnny Carson, and he was the guest. I love that skit. And and of course the Brady Bunch, I grew up watching that, and I love the episode where he kidnaps them in the cave. And you could tell, again, like I said, with almost every movie, that he's in on the joke, and you could tell he's having a great time playing the villain.
I got a postcard from him when I was at summer camp telling me he'd filmed the Brady Bunch. I was so mad at him. I was so mad. I was like, oh my God, I didn't get to meet Jan. I didn't get to meet Peter. Those were the ones who, actually, Cindy and Bobby were more my age. Yeah. But the ones I thought Jan would be my friend, and I had a total crush like everybody did on Peter. And so, they were, and I was like, I didn't get to meet Jan and Peter. I was so mad at him.
Yeah. I was a Marcia fan myself.
There you go.
Growing up, my favorite children's book was The Monster at the End of This Book, starring lovable, furry old Grover. Tell my viewers the connection your father had with this book.
I actually don't know.
Oh, he played the stage version of it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Yeah, I dug deep into the archives. I said, really? So I was trying to find clips of that. I couldn't find clips, but I read it. But yeah, he played the stage version of The Monster at the End of This Book.
Wow, where did he do it?
That I don't know. It just said I can't remember where I read this, because I was reading through books, reading on the computer. That's
very cool. So, yeah, no idea.
That's fun.
I'll ask Peter, my business partner. He'll know. Yeah.
It's a Claws Corner exclusive right here.
Yes.
Vincent Price is Grover. Now, his distinct voice helped him land voiceover work in radio such as Suspense, The Price Affair, and Hollywood Star, just to name a few. And of course, you can hear his familiar voice on Michael Jackson's Thriller. So how did that come about?
Well, he did the Mod Squad, is how it came about. And most of that episode was he and Peggy Lipton, and they just bonded. And Peggy Lipton was married to Quincy Jones. And so when Quincy Jones produced Thriller, and that was something that Michael Jackson wanted to do, he asked my dad.
So did he have a chance to meet Michael Jackson?
Yes, they recorded in the same studio. Yeah.
Okay, very cool. I love that song. I mean, that's, to me, his best album. And in 1976, he recorded a cover of Boris Pickett's Monster Mash.
Yes, that's so fun, isn't it?
Yeah, I love it. Now, his last significant roles, feature film, was Edward Scissorhands, which you mentioned was one of your favorites, and it was directed by Tim Burton. From what I was reading, your father wasn't doing so well at that time. He was sick.
He'd begun to decline, yeah, but it wasn't, it was starting, but he was still able to work. And he'd done Vincent with Tim's little short film, and so about the little boy who wants to grow up to be Vincent Price. And so Tim had written a number of parts for him, but the only one he got to do was Edward Scissorhands.
Yeah, well,
and
Tim obviously,
what a gift that was. Tim gave my dad such a gift in the perfect swan song. I mean, the perfect swan song couldn't have been better.
Oh, I love that movie. It was so great.
Much my dad could have lived another 10 years and gotten to do all kinds of Tim Burton movies. Wouldn't that have been amazing?
Yeah. Well, Tim obviously is a huge fan because I love Vincent, the stop motion action, and of course, Edward Scissorhands. Those two are great collaborators. But here's what I want to talk about. We've been going over this a lot with what you do in your life. And your father was such a Renaissance man. What made him that was his zest for life. He and your mother, Mary, had a bucket list mentality where they wanted to experience everything.
They did.
Yeah. So I wrote down a couple of the quotes of my favorite quotes. I mean, there were so many more that I love, but these are my favorites. One is, we spoke about this earlier, a man who limits his interests limits his life, which is perfect way to live. One thing for certain, that the arts keep you alive, which obviously look what he's done with everything in his life. And then this is great too. Be curious about life and cautious with it. And this one is, I think, extremely relevant now. I read this, I said, this is perfect. In art, religion, and politics, the respect must be mutual, no matter how violent the disagreement. A lot of people could learn that right now.
Yes, that's a very, very relevant one. I mean, in other words, we're all allowed to have different points of view, but we need to respect one another and act with respect toward one.
Yeah, which I wish that he was around to remind us, but that's why you're here, keeping his legacy alive and the way you live your life, letting people know it's like we can disagree, but we can also still get along.
Absolutely. And also, if we continue to be able to talk with one another, we can find new platforms for agreement.
Exactly. Your father was also, I didn't realize this until I started doing my research, he denounced racial and religious prejudice and was very supportive of gay rights.
Yes, all of those. He started out kind of like a lot of white upper middle class people with fairly conservative views, and they could be viewed as prejudicial views in some ways, but he in and of himself was just so not prejudicial. And once he realized that he'd kind of been indoctrinated to believe things that he in his own heart didn't believe, he changed. And so it was really important for him to be able to stand up and speak out on a lot of different things. And he used his celebrity to do that, even though sometimes he was scared about getting on a list. No,
I know. Well, I can only imagine. That's what it takes, a lot of guts after what happened to him to go back out and fight for what he believes in. But that's what makes him so, so important, that, fight for what you believe in, even though it might hurt you in some ways, but you always have to, be true to yourself, which you talk about too.
Absolutely.
In your life. Yep. And finally, he's done so much in his life. I want to talk about his love of cooking. He is a gourmet cook, and he and your mother authored several cookbooks.
Yeah, my mother was the better cook, but my dad loved to eat. I always say to people, that's how he started all this. He liked to eat. And then, he was just curious. So he wanted to learn how to make them himself. And then they ended up, through Sears Roebuck, writing this cookbook that became one of the most important cookbooks of the 20th century. It's called Treasury of Great Recipes. And he and my mother did it together. And everything about it was just done with thought. It was just put together in a way. It sort of had the imprimatur of a family Bible. Somebody once said to me, and I think that's very true. I think my mother would have agreed with that. And so it was an heirloom. It was something that you kept. It was something that really mattered. And so, they did this book, and through that, people wanted him on the cooking shows. So he learned how to cook. And he loved to eat, and he loved learning how to do something and really well and perfecting it. And that gave him something to learn about and something to, kind of get better at and practice. You know, I think it's really interesting right now how so many people during the pandemic, you know, took it as an excuse to learn how to do something. And many of those people, it was cooking.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think that was something my dad understood all along. Cooking something you can always get better at. You can always learn about. There's always new things to learn with cooking.
Yeah. Well, that's why, I mean, he says it in his quotes, you know, don't limit your interests, be curious, and always learn new things. And
Yes.
he's never stopped all the way up until the end.
Yep, exactly. Exactly. And he got
Well,
saddled with this kid who, you know, wasn't the most adventurous eater. So that was hilarious.
So for you, Victoria, I want to thank you very much for being on the show and taking time to talk to me about your father, about yourself. It was a pleasure having you on the show.
Oh, Rich, it's been so much fun. And thank you for, you know, this completely wide-ranging conversation. It's always this incredible joy for me to get to talk about my dad, not because he was my dad. You know, he's been gone a long time.
Yeah.
And you know, even he would say, if he were to descend right here, you know, he would say, I'm not the perfect dad. I wasn't the perfect dad. But what my dad and mom did so well was show up to life and really live it and open their hearts and minds. You know, and as they got older, it was really interesting. My dad's heart and mind opened more and my mom's closed more. And, you know, and they were really an example for me of the choices that we can make, because my mother was one of the most innovative, creative people I've ever met in my life. But she got more and more fearful, and my dad just opened. And I look at that and I think, you know, how grateful I am to have them as these role models. Mm-hmm. And so when I get to talk about them at times like this, it's not really for me because I'm talking about Vincent Price or even my own parents. It's that I got to know these people who continue to teach me how to be a better person. Yeah. And I think we all want that. We all want to be able to learn from others how to keep showing up in this world the best we can.
Well, let's plug some things. So you have the podcast, you have the book. Where can people find you?
I have a website, victoriaprice.com. I also have social media. I'll be honest, I've been having a sort of a malaise about social media. I'm just not a big fan right now of what social media is doing. And so I've pulled off of it. I know I'm going to have to go back on it, but right now I just don't miss it at all.
Yeah.
So happy
No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to say it's become a platform for hatred lately.
Yeah, it just doesn't feel, I don't know, authentic. So I have a website, okay. And you can find everything on the website. It's victoriaprice.com. And, you know, should you be a social media person, I have those platforms as well. It's all my social media is the same. I'm Victoria Price, and I am Victoria Price. And then, yeah, you can find my books. Please shop on bookshop.org. It's a wonderful independent platform that offers the same services as Amazon, but actually supports authors and independent bookstores. And we're not going to have independent bookstores if we don't support them. So please support independent bookstores in buying your books. But you can find all of my books there and all of my parents' books. And I created a Price Family shop on bookshop.org where you can find all of our books.
Right. And I know everything's up in the air because while we're filming this, it's still in the middle of the pandemic. So what's next for you?
I have some fun virtual events. Please check out followspot.live for all our virtual events that I co-host with Peter Fuller. We'll have those going all the rest of this year. We have Butch Patrick and Sarah Douglas and Dennis O'Hare and a bunch of other people coming up. So I'm excited about that. And I think that'll be a lot of fun. And I've got some virtual events, one to benefit the Poe House in Baltimore coming up, and some other virtual events that I think will be a lot of fun. And then, you know, theoretically in the new year, as things begin to open up, all the events that I was scheduled to do in 2020 have been postponed to 2021. Plus I had a ton of events in 2021 already. So 2021 is looking to be a busy year.
And don't forget, there's one other thing you have to do is marry me and my fiance, Sarah.
Fantastic. I would love that.
Once again, Victoria, Thank you very much. You are a great guest, very interesting, very friendly, and I look forward to seeing you again very, very soon.
Thank you so much, Rich. This was so much fun.
I had a great time. That wraps up another episode of the Claus Corner of the Zoom edition. I would like to thank my guest, the Renaissance woman, Victoria Price, for coming on here to talk about herself, and the Renaissance man, her father, the great Vincent Price. I would also like to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in. Enjoy your day, everyone.